Nice to meet you again. Today, let's get into the very heart of what was taught in the schools, the curriculum. This is where the cultural battle lines were often most sharply drawn, and where the colonizers' worldview really tried to take root. When you think about any school system, what's actually being taught? The curriculum. That's the real engine, isn't it? It dictates what children learn, how they learn it, and what's considered important. In colonial times, the curriculum wasn't just some neutral list of subjects. It was a battleground, a meticulously designed weapon for cultural influence. It was a hugely powerful tool meant to spread the colonizers' way of seeing the world, while at the same time, very deliberately, pushing indigenous ways of knowing right out of the picture. This intentional focus on Europe aimed to create students whose entire way of thinking was tethered to the mother country. But, of course, it also caused a huge sense of disconnection and, eventually, sparked a long, drawn-out fight to get rid of that colonial mindset in schools. Eurocentric curriculum dominance. Colonial curricula were almost universally, almost aggressively, centered on Europe. Imagine it. European history, geography, literature, science, and values were held up as the gold standard of human achievement, the universal yardstick against which every other culture was measured. Taught from the perspective of European discovery, conquest, and progress, history lessons were a nonstop tour of European empires, their mighty explorers, and their grand wars. The history of the colonized land itself? Well, that often conveniently started with the Europeans' arrival, with anything before that being dismissed as primitive, stuck in time, or simply not worth mentioning. These colonial stories loved to pump up the achievements of the colonizers, their neat administrations, the roads and railways they built, their civilizing influence, all while quietly downplaying or outright justifying the exploitation and violence that came with it. For example, if you were a student in British India, your history textbooks would meticulously lay out the rise of the British Empire, the wonders of the Industrial Revolution, and the brilliance of European political thought. Indian history, meanwhile, would often be framed as a series of internal squabbles that only the British could, benevolently, of course, sort out. Indigenous histories often ignored or denigrated. The rich local histories, the incredible oral traditions, the sophisticated political and social systems that existed before the Europeans showed up. All of that was either completely left out or actively belittled. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate move to cut the colonized off from their own past, making them more likely to swallow the colonizers' narrative of progress and, crucially, their own supposed need for European guidance. Focused on Europe and the colonial power, geography classes were essentially a European tour. Students would learn all the capitals of Europe, the major rivers, and the geography of the empire's vast trade routes. It was all about understanding the world from a European vantage point. Local geography taught only as it related to colonial administration/resource extraction. The geography of the colony itself? That was usually taught only in terms of how it served the colonizer's economic interests. Where the valuable minerals were the best places for plantations, the administrative boundaries they had drawn, and the infrastructure, like railways to transport raw materials, they had built. All that intricate local knowledge about ecosystems, traditional farming methods, or indigenous navigation skills, largely irrelevant in the colonial classroom. Emphasis on European classics. Literary studies were a shrine to the great European writers, Shakespeare, Molière, Dante, Camões. These authors and their works were presented as the absolute pinnacle of human genius and universal moral values. Students were expected to dissect and appreciate these texts, often with little to no connection to their own lives or cultural context. It was almost as if culture and literature were exclusively European inventions. Indigenous literature, oral or written, largely absent. Any rich oral traditions, the epics, the folk tales, the proverbs, or existing written literatures of colonized societies were almost entirely excluded from the formal curriculum. They simply weren't considered worthy of academic study, or, frankly, sometimes their very existence was denied. This further reinforced the idea that high culture and sophisticated storytelling belonged solely to Europe, taught according to European models. While science and math are often seen as universal, their teaching under colonialism was deeply rooted in European scientific traditions. This often meant ignoring or even actively dismissing local scientific knowledge, astronomical observations, traditional medicine, or technological innovations that had existed long before the Europeans arrived. It simply fed the myth that scientific inquiry was an exclusively European achievement. Practical application for colonial needs. Even scientific education, particularly in vocational schools, was usually geared towards practical applications that directly benefited the colonial economy. Things like improving agricultural yields for export, extracting minerals, or building basic infrastructure. It wasn't about fostering independent scientific research or innovation that would serve the local population's broader needs. Instilled European moral codes, political systems, and notions of civilization. Civics lessons were pretty blunt. They taught unwavering loyalty to the colonial power, absolute obedience to authority, and drilled in the superiority of European political systems, parliamentary democracy, republicanism, over any indigenous forms of governance, which were usually painted as chaotic or tyrannical. Moral education often revolved around Christian virtues, even in ostensibly secular schools, and would subtly, or not so subtly, rubbish indigenous ethical frameworks. Impact on identity and worldview. All this relentless focus on a Eurocentric curriculum had truly profound and often deeply damaging psychological and social effects on the colonized, especially those who made it through the education system and became part of the educated elite. Internalized inferiority. By constantly presenting European culture, history, and knowledge as the best, the most advanced, and their own heritage as either missing or just not as good, the curriculum instilled a deep, painful sense of inferiority in many students. They were essentially taught to look down on their own background, believing that the only path to real progress was to mimic the West. Alienation. Those who got a good education often found themselves feeling genuinely alienated from their own cultural roots, and, perhaps even more painfully, from the vast majority of their own non-educated people. They spoke a different language, admired different heroes, and held different values. This cultural schizophrenia, as some have called it, created a massive gap between the westernized elite and the traditional masses, a division that, rather sadly, complicated the whole nation-building process after independence. Mental colonization. This is a really powerful concept, articulated so well by thinkers like Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The curriculum was a primary tool for mental colonization, a process where the colonized start to adopt the colonizer's entire worldview, their values, their ways of thinking, almost as if they were their own. Sometimes, they even started policing themselves according to these colonial standards. This intellectual subservience meant that even after political independence, many educational institutions actually kept chugging along with a fundamentally colonial mindset, which, of course, just perpetuated a reliance on Western knowledge. Challenges to the Eurocentric narrative. Now, even with such a pervasive and suffocating Eurocentric curriculum, it's important to remember that people weren't entirely passive. There were continuous efforts, some subtle, some quite overt, to push back against this dominance and to bring indigenous knowledge back into its rightful place. Toward the tail end of the colonial period, early nationalist movements and intellectuals really started to pick apart the Eurocentric curriculum, demanding that local history, culture, and heroes be included. These efforts often happened outside the formal colonial school system, perhaps in independent schools or cultural societies. all with the goal of instilling pride in their own heritage. For instance, in India, brilliant thinkers like Rabindranath Tagore were promoting alternative educational ideas that were deeply rooted in Indian philosophy and art, a real counter-narrative. Once political independence arrived, one of the most urgent and fundamental tasks for these new nations was to decolonize their education systems, and curriculum reform was right at the top of that list. Africanization/indigenization of curriculum. This became a rallying cry and a core policy goal in many newly independent African nations. There were huge efforts to weave local history, geography, literature, and cultural studies into the curriculum. Textbooks were rewritten to celebrate national heroes, ancient kingdoms, and local environmental knowledge. The whole point was to make education relevant to local realities, to build a strong national identity, and to affirm a sense of cultural pride. Challenges, but despite the strong political will, getting rid of that Eurocentric curriculum was incredibly tough. They faced massive hurdles. Lack of resources, developing brand new textbooks, teaching materials, and entire curricula tailored to a national context required huge financial resources and expertise that most new nations simply didn't have readily available. Trained personnel. There was also a real shortage of teachers who were actually trained in this new, indigenized content, especially at the higher education levels. Many teachers themselves had been educated under the colonial system, so changing their mindset was a big ask. Political will and prioritization. Sometimes, that strong political desire to completely decolonize got diluted by other immediate, pressing national problems. Or, frankly, the lingering prestige of Western educational models, because, let's face it, they were still seen as the gold standard for international recognition, sometimes held things back. Ongoing debates about balancing global knowledge with local relevance. This is still a really thorny issue today. How do you integrate invaluable indigenous knowledge systems with the universally accepted scientific and technological advancements? Post-colonial curricula are constantly trying to walk this tightrope. How to genuinely reflect local contexts and values while still preparing students for a globally interconnected world. This struggle is a testament to the ongoing effort to create an education system that is both authentically cultural and effectively promotes development. So, in a nutshell, the colonial curriculum was this incredibly potent instrument for pushing a particular culture and for shaping how people thought. Its overwhelming focus on Europe led to the sad devaluation of local knowledge and created a profound sense of cultural loss for many, while finally gaining political independence opened the door for change. The long shadow of this Eurocentrism continues to pose a complex and ongoing challenge for post-colonial nations, trying to build education systems that truly speak to their own histories, their own cultures, and their own vibrant aspirations.